The forest began long before the road ended. The deeper he drove into the Ozarks, the more the world behind him seemed to fade. Gas stations disappeared, cell service died, and the silence of the trees grew heavier, as if nature itself was guarding a secret. Locals had called it superstition, an old ghost tale meant to keep people away. But the letter in his glove box said otherwise. It was dated 1962. The paper was yellowed, the ink trembling with age, and at the bottom was a single line that wouldn't stop echoing in his head: "They're still up there, but they're not like us anymore." By the time he reached the broken sign that read Hollow Creek, he already felt watched. The forest was too still, the air too dense, and a smell, faintly metallic, faintly sweet, hung between the trees. His boots sank into the damp earth as he followed the remnants of a forgotten trail, the kind made not for travelers but for people who never wanted to be found. There were no birds. No wind. Only the rhythmic creak of the woods settling, and his own breathing echoing back at him. The deeper he went, the stranger it felt, like walking into a place where time had stopped caring. The first cabin appeared half buried in the mud, its windows shattered, its door hanging open. Something about it felt alive, like the walls were listening. Inside, he found the remains of a family photograph nailed crookedly to the wall. The faces had been scratched out, everyone except the smallest figure, a child staring directly into the lens, eyes pale and hollow. Underneath the frame, a single word had been carved into the wood with a trembling hand: "Remember." The story begins with a journalist from St. Louis, a man whose curiosity often outweighed his fear. He had built a reputation on uncovering forgotten American tragedies, stories buried under small-town silence and generations of guilt. One cold November morning, while sorting through old case files for an article about rural disappearances, he came across a weathered envelope at the bottom of an evidence box. It had no return address, only his name written in ink that had nearly faded into the paper. The postmark was dated 1962, more than 60 years ago. Inside was a letter written on brittle stationery, its words trembling as if the writer's hands had been shaking. It spoke of a family that had gone wrong in the blood, hidden deep within the Ozark Mountains, a family no one was supposed to find. The letter's tone was desperate, almost confessional, as though its author had seen something that could not be unseen. It described strange sounds echoing from the woods at night, figures glimpsed between the trees, and a small settlement erased from every map after a series of disappearances in the 1930s. The message ended with a chilling line: "Asterisk, if anyone ever reads this, know that they're still up there, but they're not like us anymore." Asterisk for the journalist, those words were not just a warning, they were an invitation. He spent the next few days searching archives, trying to verify whether a place called Hollow Creek had ever existed. It didn't appear in any official records, yet a few faded mentions surfaced in pre-war census lists, suggesting that a small cluster of families had once lived in the mountains before suddenly vanishing from documentation. No death records, no relocations, just silence. The more he searched, the more the mystery grew. Locals from nearby towns refused to talk about it, some hung up the phone as soon as he mentioned the name. One elderly librarian whispered that the government had let the hills keep their secret. What intrigued him most was that the letter had somehow found its way to him after all those years, with no indication of who sent it or why it had resurfaced now. There was no reason for his name to be on it, no logical link between him and the events of a lost mountain village. It was as if the past had chosen him. The ink, the trembling handwriting, the faint trace of fear that seemed to rise from the paper, all of it pulled him toward the truth hiding in those mountains, a truth the rest of the world had long stopped wanting to know. When the journalist finally arrived in the nearest town at the edge of the Ozarks, he quickly realized that the silence surrounding Hollow Creek was not just about ignorance, it was about fear. The locals spoke in half sentences, exchanged uneasy glances, and seemed to grow more nervous the longer he lingered in conversation. The town itself looked frozen in time, a scattering of weathered wooden houses, a single gas pump, and a diner that smelled of old coffee and damp wood. Everyone knew everyone, yet everyone pretended not to know him. When he asked about Hollow Creek, the room would go still, like someone had turned off the air. It was the same pattern every time, a long pause, a shake of the head, and a muttered warning to leave the past where it belongs. The first person to speak honestly with him was an old man sitting outside the general store, whittling a piece of cedar. His face was lined like the rings of a tree, each crease carrying a lifetime of things he'd rather forget. When the journalist mentioned the name Hollow Creek, the man's hands froze mid-cut. He looked up with watery eyes and said quietly, "Boy, that place ain't meant for folks like you. You don't find Hollow Creek, it finds you. And when it does, you don't come back the same." Then he stood, dropped his carving, and walked away without another word. The journalist noted every phrase, every expression, sensing there was truth hidden behind their superstitions. Later that evening in the diner, a waitress slid his plate onto the counter without meeting his eyes. Her voice was low, trembling slightly as she whispered, "If you know what's good for you, you'll turn around before the trees swallow you." People used to go looking for that family. None of them ever came back. Her words weren't a threat, they were a plea. It was as if the entire town carried a shared memory, something too awful to repeat aloud. He spent the night in a small rented cabin, the letter spread open on the table beside him. The sound of the wind outside felt unnatural, almost rhythmic, as though the forest was breathing in its sleep. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching from beyond the tree line. Yet beneath the unease, his curiosity only deepened. Every warning, every fearful glance, every refusal to speak made him believe there was something real buried beneath the folklore. To a man who had built his life on unearthing the forgotten, fear was only another form of invitation. The next morning, fog blanketed the valley like a living thing, thick and unmoving, swallowing the shapes of trees and roads until the world seemed reduced to grey silence. The journalist loaded his camera, compass, and a small recorder into his bag and set out toward the mountains. The townsfolk had said Hollow Creek no longer existed, but he'd found a faint trail on an old forestry map, an unmarked logging road that cut deep into the Ozark wilderness. The road began as gravel, then thinned to dirt, and finally became nothing more than a path carved by time and neglect. Fallen branches cracked under his boots, and every few yards, he found traces of what might have been old human life: a rusted horseshoe, a broken jar, a piece of barbed wire half swallowed by roots. The forest felt ancient, almost aware, and each gust of wind seemed to carry whispers that faded before he could understand them. After several hours of hiking, he stumbled upon what looked like the remains of a wagon trail, two deep grooves in the earth, overgrown with weeds and moss, leading toward the heart of the mountain. That was when he first noticed the bones. At first glance, they seemed like those of small animals, scattered near the base of a tree, but the longer he looked, the more unnatural they appeared. Some were too large, some crudely arranged in circular patterns, and others hung from branches with strips of old cloth tied around them, as if marking territory or sending a warning. The smell of decay lingered faintly in the damp air, sharp and metallic. Farther down the trail, he found a row of makeshift traps, rusted steel contraptions covered in leaves and dirt, their edges still sharp. Something or someone had placed them deliberately, not recently, but not long enough ago to be forgotten either. He photographed everything, though his hands shook slightly each time he clicked the shutter. It was clear now that this wasn't just abandoned land. It was guarded. As dusk began to settle, the forest grew darker in tone, its sounds sharper and more fragmented. The snapping of twigs, the distant cry of something unseen, it all seemed to move closer each time he stopped to listen. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of wet earth and something faintly sweet, like decaying fruit. The trail eventually led to a clearing where the remnants of a small cabin slumped under the weight of time. The structure was barely standing, its roof caved in, its walls blackened by rot. Yet among the ruin, there was something deliberate: symbols carved into the doorframe, patterns that looked less like decoration and more like a warning to stay out. The journalist felt a chill crawl up his spine as the last light faded, realizing this was not a place forgotten by accident. The cabin stood in the clearing like a corpse that refused to rot, its timbers sagging, its windows clouded with grime that filtered out the last traces of daylight. The journalist approached slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand as if his body already knew what his mind refused to admit. The air around the structure was colder than the rest of the woods, carrying a damp smell of mildew, ash, and something faintly sweet like decayed fruit. As he stepped onto the warped porch, the old boards moaned under his weight, the sound echoing through the trees like a cry. When he pushed open the door, the hinges screamed in protest, revealing a darkness that seemed to breathe. Inside, The cabin looked untouched by time yet abandoned for decades. Cobwebs hung like curtains, and the floor was layered with dust thick enough to hold footprints that weren't his own. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the kind that no photograph could capture, only haunt. He panned his flashlight across the walls, and that was when he saw the carvings. Strange symbols gouged deep into the wood, circles intersecting with lines, rough handprints pressed in ash. They weren't random. They looked ritualistic, deliberate, as though each one marked a moment of fear or pain. The deeper he moved inside, the more symbols appeared, crawling up the walls like a language no one was meant to read. Near what had once been a fireplace, a wooden chair lay broken beside a pile of old photographs scattered across the dirt floor. He crouched down, brushing off the grime with his sleeve. The images were faded and warped by moisture, but he could still make out figures, men, women, and children, posing stiffly outside the same cabin he now stood in. Their faces were almost human, yet something was off. Eyes too far apart, smiles that didn't reach their eyes, limbs slightly uneven, as though the photographer had caught them in the middle of becoming something else. In one photo, a child stared directly into the camera, his expression vacant but aware, a faint blur around his hand suggesting motion or trembling. The journalist gathered the photographs, his pulse rising with each one he turned over. A few had names scribbled on the back, but the ink had bled into the paper, rendering them unreadable. When he lifted his flashlight again, the beam caught a new detail on the wall, a phrase scratched beneath the largest symbol, letters jagged and uneven, written by a trembling hand, *, we tried to stop it. *, the words were old, carved deep into the grain, and their meaning pressed into him like a physical weight. It was not a warning left for outsiders. It was a confession from within. Night had settled thick over the mountains, a living darkness that seemed to absorb sound rather than carry it. The journalist sat near the ruined fireplace of the cabin, the dim glow of his lantern flickering against the carvings that crawled across the walls. He had planned to leave before sundown, but curiosity had a way of dulling his sense of danger. The silence outside was so absolute it began to feel unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Every creak of the wood, every distant rustle felt amplified in the stillness. He tried to convince himself that the sounds were just the wind, the echo of branches swaying in the cold air. But then he heard it, a faint, dragging shuffle coming from beyond the doorway. He froze, his hand hovering over the lantern's handle, the beam trembling as it cut across the darkness. The sound came again, slow, uneven, almost human. When he stepped toward the open door, the cold hit him first, sharp enough to sting his lungs. He swept the light across the clearing, and that was when he saw her. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees, motionless, as if carved from the same earth she stood on. Her hair hung in tangled ropes, her clothes torn and colorless, and her skin looked pale even in the dim light, almost gray. She didn't move until he took a step closer. Then, slowly, her head turned toward him, and the light revealed her face, sunken eyes clouded with a milky haze, skin stretched tight across the bones, lips trembling as she spoke words that barely reached his ears. At first, he couldn't understand what she was saying. Her voice was broken, caught somewhere between a whisper and a groan. He moved closer, recording instinctively, and caught a phrase that sent a shiver through him. * the blood stayed too pure. She repeated it, rocking slightly as though the words were not meant to be spoken aloud but couldn't be kept in any longer. Her expression shifted between confusion and grief, her eyes never fully meeting his. It was as if she was looking through him, seeing someone or something else behind his face. Before he could speak, she took a few steps backward, her movements jerky and unsteady. The forest seemed to swallow her whole as she disappeared into the mist, her figure melting into the darkness. The sound of her dragging footsteps faded until only silence remained. He stood there for a long time, unable to move, the echo of her words pulsing in his mind. Somewhere deep inside, he understood that the family hadn't vanished into legend, they were still here, and she was proof that the story wasn't over. The encounter with the old woman left the journalist shaken, but it also confirmed what he had begun to suspect, the stories weren't folklore. There was something still alive in those woods, something that had endured where no one should have. Sleep was impossible that night. Every sound outside the cabin made his nerves tighten, the scrape of branches, the faint shuffle of leaves, and once, what sounded like a child's low cry echoing between the trees. When morning finally broke, he packed what little equipment he had left and began following the direction in which the woman had vanished. The fog was thinner now, allowing shards of sunlight to pierce through the canopy, but the light didn't bring comfort. It only revealed more signs that the forest had been lived in. He found a small trail branching away from the main path, almost invisible under the layers of dead leaves. The footprints were faint but recent, bare, narrow, and oddly misshapen, as if the toes were fused together or bent in unnatural ways. He followed them deeper into the woods, where the air grew heavier and the silence returned. The trail led to what looked like a cluster of shacks built from mismatched wood and rusted metal, half collapsed and overtaken by vines. It wasn't a village in any normal sense. It was a collection of shelters, improvised and hidden so well that he might have walked past them if not for the faint smell of smoke. He crouched near one of the structures, peering through a broken wall. Inside, the floor was lined with straw and tattered blankets. Hanging from the ceiling were bundles of dried herbs, animal bones, and jars filled with cloudy liquid. A child's toy, a crude doll made of sticks and twine, lay in the corner, its head painted with a face that looked more real than it should have. The place didn't feel abandoned. The ashes in a nearby fire pit were still warm. A rustle behind him made him spin around, but there was no one there. Yet he could feel it, the sensation of being watched again, sharper and heavier than before. It was as if the forest itself had eyes. He remembered the old woman's words and began to understand them differently now. The family hadn't disappeared, they had withdrawn, retreating into isolation so complete that time had forgotten them. Their lineage had continued in secret, generation after generation, hidden within these woods. The deformities, the fear, the silence, it all pointed to one truth that chilled him more than any ghost story could. They hadn't vanished into the earth. They had survived. As he pushed deeper into the forest settlement, the ground beneath his feet began to change. The soil grew softer, darker, as if it had been disturbed again and again over the years. The air carried a faint, metallic scent, like rust and decay blended with the sweet, rotting smell of wet leaves. The shacks grew fewer until he reached a clearing where the trees bent outward in an unnatural circle, their roots twisting above the ground as though rejecting the soil beneath them. It was there that he noticed the first mound. At first, he thought it was another rise of earth left by erosion, but then he saw the wooden cross driven into its center, crudely cut and half-rotted by rain. A few feet away stood another, smaller one, and then another. Within moments he realized the clearing was filled with them, dozens of uneven burial mounds stretching into the fog. Each grave was different, yet all bore the same silent signature of secrecy. No names, no dates, only crosses made from whatever would have been nearby. Some were marked with symbols like those carved into the cabin walls, while others were ringed with stones, as though meant to hold something inside. He knelt by one of the smaller mounds, brushing away the wet leaves that had gathered over time. Beneath them, he found fragments of fabric child-sized, faded almost white, and the corner of what looked like an old photograph pressed into the dirt. He lifted it carefully, the image barely visible now, but the outline of a family could still be made out. Four figures stood together, their faces smudged by time and moisture, their posture unnaturally stiff. He could almost recognize the cabin behind them. The unease in his chest deepened into dread. These graves weren't ancient, some were fresh, the soil still loose, the crosses newly hammered. The realization crept over him that someone had been here recently, still tending to this place, still burying the dead. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the clearing, expecting to see movement between the trees. Nothing stirred, yet the silence pressed in on him like a living thing. The forest no longer felt empty, it felt occupied. He began to take photographs, his hands trembling as he documented the rows of mounds. Each click of the camera shutter felt like an intrusion. A sudden gust of wind passed through the clearing, rattling the crosses and carrying with it a low, whispering sound that might have been the wind or might have been voices. The weight of the earth, the smell of rot, the crude memorials, it all felt wrong, like a cemetery built not out of reverence but out of desperation. Whatever had lived here hadn't simply died. It had been buried to keep something hidden. The longer he lingered among the graves, the more the air itself seemed to turn against him. The forest had grown impossibly quiet, as if every living creature had fled. Even the wind seemed to stop breathing. He stood still, listening, trying to convince himself that the faint murmurs around him were nothing more than the echo of his own heartbeat. But then, beneath the stillness, came a sound, soft and deliberate, like footsteps pressing into damp leaves. He turned sharply, his flashlight cutting across the fog, but there was nothing there, only the twisting shapes of trees. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the faint rustle of something brushing against the grass. His chest tightened as instinct warned him that he was no longer alone. He began to back away from the mounds, careful not to make noise. The trees around the clearing seemed to shift subtly, as if closing in. He told himself it was just the fog distorting shapes, but the feeling of being watched had become undeniable. Somewhere beyond the mist, something was moving with intention, slowly, circling him. He could hear the snapping of twigs, the low drag of feet through the earth, and once, a sound that chilled him to his core, a wet, labored breathing, close enough that he could feel it stir the air. The graves no longer felt like resting places, they felt like boundaries, and he had stepped past them. He lifted his camera, hoping to catch proof of what was stalking him, but the flash only revealed empty forest. When his vision cleared, he thought he saw shapes at the edge of the clearing, pale outlines, half hidden behind the trees. They didn't move the way people should, their motions were jerky, almost disjointed, as if their bodies had forgotten how to carry themselves properly. His first instinct was to run, but fear anchored him in place. It wasn't until one of the shapes tilted its head, the light catching the glint of an eye, that his paralysis broke. He turned and fled through the woods, the sounds of pursuit following close behind, branches snapping, breaths rasping, the shuffle of more than one pair of feet. The fog distorted everything, he couldn't tell how many there were or where they were coming from. His flashlight beam swung wildly, catching flashes of movement that vanished as quickly as they appeared. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, conspiring to keep him lost. The air thickened, his lungs burning as he stumbled over roots and rocks, and still the sounds followed, neither faster nor slower, only constant. They weren't chasing him to catch him. They were herding him, guiding him somewhere deeper, somewhere he wasn't meant to see. The forest finally released him into another clearing, smaller than the last, where the ground was uneven and littered with remnants of things that didn't belong there: broken toys, rusted metal pails, glass jars half buried in the mud. The air was thicker here, humid and heavy with a sweet rot that clung to the back of his throat. His flashlight flickered as he caught sight of a half-collapsed structure built into the side of a hill. It looked like the entrance to a root cellar, the kind used in the old days to store food through winter. The wooden door was swollen from years of damp, but a faint draft of cold air breathed out from the cracks, carrying with it a stench that made his stomach turn. He hesitated only for a moment before forcing the door open. The hinges shrieked, and the sound seemed to vanish into the earth rather than echo. The space beyond was narrow and low, the ceiling supported by warped beams that looked ready to fall. He descended slowly, the dirt steps slick under his boots. The deeper he went, the colder it became, and the smell intensified: earth, decay, and something chemical. The beam of his flashlight shook as he swept it across the room, revealing shelves lining the walls, filled with rows of glass jars. At first, he thought they contained fruit or herbs preserved in liquid, but as he stepped closer, the shapes inside became clear. They were small, deformed hands, eyes, organs suspended in amber-colored fluid. Each jar had a strip of paper beneath it, the ink long faded but still legible in places, marked with dates that spanned generations. It wasn't food storage. It was preservation of a different kind. In the far corner of the room, a child's wooden chair sat facing the wall. Around it were scattered bones, some small and fragile, others unmistakably human. Among them lay a set of worn children's toys, a doll missing its face, a small carved horse, and a metal rattle streaked with rust. The lantern light caught on something else then, a series of photographs pinned to the wooden beam above the chair. Each one showed the same family, their faces more distorted in each successive picture. The final photograph was the most disturbing. Only the child remained, older now, his eyes pale and vacant, his expression neither human nor animal. The journalist's breath caught as he realized the cellar wasn't abandoned. In the corner, beyond the edge of his light, he heard the faint sound of movement, soft, uneven, almost rhythmic. A whisper followed, low and uncertain, repeating a single word over and over, a word that echoed through the cold air until it no longer sounded like language at all. He raised his flashlight slowly toward the sound, and the reflection that met his eyes wasn't glass. It blinked. The flashlight fell from his trembling hand, rolling across the dirt floor and casting wild arcs of light on the cellar walls. For a moment, the beam caught what he thought was a reflection, but as it steadied, he saw the outline of something standing at the edge of the shadows. It was the child from the photograph, or what was left of him. His skin was pale and stretched thin like wax, veins webbing just beneath the surface. His hair was sparse, his eyes unfocused yet aware, and his limbs hung at odd angles, as if they had grown without guidance. He wasn't breathing heavily or moving with fear, he simply stared, blinking slowly, tilting his head like an animal unsure of what it was seeing. The journalist froze, unable to speak, the weight of every whispered rumor crashing into reality before his eyes. Then came another sound, the dragging of a foot, a slow shuffle from deeper in the cellar. The light flickered toward the corner and revealed more figures emerging from the dark recesses of the room. A man and a woman, their bodies twisted and malformed, their faces eerily similar to the child's. Their eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light, reflecting something not quite human. They moved closer, but not with anger or aggression, it was curiosity, like creatures confronting a visitor who had trespassed into their burrow after decades of isolation. The journalist backed up until his shoulders met the doorframe, his mind racing to find words, logic, or even a scream, but his throat had turned to stone. The woman reached out a hand, trembling and bony, and in that instant, he saw that her fingers were fused together, her nails long and yellowed. She murmured something in a voice that sounded like a child learning to speak, fragmented syllables of a language that didn't fully exist. Her tone was neither pleading nor threatening, but desperate in a way that pierced him deeper than fear. The man behind her watched silently, his mouth twitching as if trying to form a word. They seemed more broken than monstrous, more tragic than dangerous. But the smell, the jars, the bones, it all spoke of something darker, something that had once been human and had long since decayed into instinct and survival. The child stepped forward again and pointed toward the shelves of jars, then toward the journalist's camera. His meaning was unmistakable. He wanted to be seen, to be remembered, to have their story told. The journalist reached for his camera with shaking hands, and the flash went off, flooding the cellar with harsh white light for an instant. When his eyes adjusted, the figures were gone. Only the echo of that single whisper remained, rising faintly from the darkness, a sound like the forest itself exhaling after holding its breath for generations.